In this video, we're talking about some major disclosure issues the seller may or may not have to tell you before you buy their home. Now, every state and jurisdiction is different, so take what we're bringing to you and make sure that you're asking the appropriate questions regardless of whether the seller is required to disclose or not. I do want to point out that in today's day and age, we have the internet and YouTube. So do your own due diligence before you buy any home. Now let's go ahead and dive into some of the top home buyer concerns, things that we have learned through the years and what the sellers may not want you to know. Melissa, we know here at Sachs Realty that complaints are up in Maryland and probably a large part of the country, especially with buyers, all the exuberance in them spending so much money on their homes over the last 2 years. They have a lot of regret. So let's kind of talk about what the number one major disclosure a buyer may want to know about a home. So in Maryland, there is no requirement for a seller to disclose whether somebody was murdered, whether there was a suicide or a death of natural cause in the home. Melissa, is that something that you would want to know?
For me, 100% yes. I would want to know that for sure.
You know, one of the reasons that you may want to know whether there was a death or especially a murder or a suicide as a buyer is because that home may have some type of stigma with it. And, you know, I mean, think about it. Would it bother you or not? And for some, you know, it may not be that big a deal. But I can tell you that we know of a situation here in Maryland where the buyer of the home was doing a home inspection and the neighbor came over and asked the buyers if they were the buyers. They said, yes, we're actually doing a home inspection, but we're looking forward to buying the home. And the neighbor said to them, well, do you know what happened in the home? And of course, they said no. And the neighbor went on to tell them that there was a murder-suicide many years ago in the home, and it really freaked out the buyers. Mm-hmm. Now, they ended up moving forward anyway, but this was not something that was a requirement to be disclosed. But guys, you know, you have to ask yourself, is that something that would be important to you? And you should probably Google search the address of a home that you're interested in buying and fill yourself in on the details.
Absolutely. Especially if you were an out-of-town buyer, had no idea the area. Would you want to move in and your neighbors know what went down in that house? Maybe not.
Something else that's really big is, you know, there are some states that have disclosure forms that have to disclose whether the seller knows of any paranormal activity, whether the house is haunted.
There are certain parts of our country that are known, especially Salem, Massachusetts, for one. And, you know, haunted houses are a real thing for some people.
Now, whether you believe that or not, there was a case in 1991, and there's an article that I'll link below that this law firm had published. Basically, in 1991, a New York case of Stambovsky and Ackley, commonly known as the Ghostbusters ruling, where a buyer actually sued the seller and the seller's realtor for failure to disclose the house's ghostly reputation. Prior to putting the home up for sale, the home had this notoriety and media coverage about it being haunted, but the out-of-town buyers in this case were unaware of the home's history. Although the court did not rule non-disclosure of the house's reputation as fraudulent, it did allow the buyer to back out of his contract and get his down payment back. New York State declared that sellers must disclose if a house is haunted only if they have already shared this opinion to the public at large. But as long as they kept this supernatural encounter to themselves, they're under no obligation to speak up when it's time to sell.
Next, we're going to talk about the neighbor and neighborhood nuisance. In some counties and states, it's important to disclose if there are military facilities nearby, airports nearby, and other factors that can cause extreme disturbances.
Yeah, we do have locally here in Maryland, if you're near Baltimore, Washington International Airport, there's an actual airport disclosure form. Letting people know, hey, if you're going to move into the area, you're going to hear frequent airplanes going over. I know a lot of neighborhoods are subjected to those change in patterns. So, when the weather's bad, the air traffic control reroutes planes over certain neighborhoods. And it can be quite annoying if every 30 or 60 seconds you have a low flying plane. So these are important things to know. But there are also other nuisances that can be in the neighborhood. Some people are offended at different odors. And I know back in the day, we have a lot of rural areas here in Maryland. And, if you moved to the country, you would just expect that from time to time. You'd smell things like manure. But now we have disclosure forms in farming districts that let people know, hey, every now and then it might stink.
Something else on the odor side, you have mills. There could be paper mills, spice mills that may be offensive at times. Also, for example, locally, we have a quarry here, which brings along dust, brings along vibrations on the ground, something you may not think about if you're not familiar with the area.
Every day at 12 o'clock, Monday through Friday, we hear a blast underground from them blasting dynamite in this gravel quarry. And yes, we get so dusty, and we're a business, but there are houses around us as well. And living in areas next to a quarry, you may experience excessive amount of dust. There are also things that, landfills, shooting ranges. There's a whole lot of things that can be neighborhood nuisances. And if you're not familiar with the area, you should make sure that you're checking out what's around, what can affect you, because for some people, this could affect whether they would live there or buy there or not. And I'll tell you that you should be checking the neighborhood, not just the maps and the things that could be affecting the immediate neighborhood, but you should also visit the neighborhood or the home at different parts of the day, night, and weekend. Because, if you're visiting a house Saturday at 11 o'clock and you're putting an offer in and you're going back for your home inspection, on a Saturday because you're working during the week, you may not hear some of these noises or neighborhood nuisances that happen between 9 to 5 during the day. I can tell you personally that I know a seller in Colorado that one of the reasons they're selling their home is because in the summertime, they experience a lot of forest fires. There could be excessive smoke that prevents you from seeing the beautiful mountains. And also it could be a health hazard to some if you have asthma or any other types of conditions where, breathing in smoky air could affect you in a negative way.
Environmental hazards are also something that you need to think about when purchasing a home. What has been on the property? You could potentially have a buried oil tank in the backyard.
I had a situation one time just like that. The seller had an underground tank and they were just going to make it go away and put an above ground tank, or that would have been a major disclosure issue to potential buyers. Because that's something that could cost a lot of money to the buyer if they found out about it later, a leaky tank, whatever, big problem. The other one's lead paint. Federally, it's required that if you have knowledge or reports about lead paint within the home, especially homes built before 1978, that's the cutoff for a disclosure that if a seller has knowledge of lead paint in the house or reports stating that there is lead paint, that they need to provide that to potential buyers.
Radon gas is also something that you need to be aware of. It's fairly common in Maryland because we do have basements, and it's something that may need to be remediated.
Yeah, it's especially common when you have lower level, underground living areas, and there are limits, though they say there's no safe limit to have radon gas in your home to be breathing it in. They compare it to cigarette smoking, as dangerous as cigarette smoking. And, we do want to make sure that if it reaches a certain level to where it should be mediated, that a mitigation system is put in to get those toxic fumes out of the house. Another important disclosure is whether the home you're buying is located within a homeowners association or condominium association, whereas there are certain things that you can and cannot do as governed by these regulations. Now, here in Maryland, we have to notify the buyer prior to them putting an offer if that property is subjected to a homeowners association or a condominium association. I can tell you personally that I had a situation when I first got my real estate license where I represented the seller. I had the listing, and when we filled out the paperwork, I specifically asked the seller if they had a homeowners association, of which she said no. So she checked the box no, she signed a document, and I sold the house. A couple weeks later, I got a phone call from the buyers. They said, we have a big problem. And, this buyer was a scuba diver instructor. And one of the reasons that they bought this beautiful lot, very big property, several acres, was because that the buyer had a very large shed where he put all his scuba gear, and he would grab it and take it out to give lessons. Well, shortly after he had his shed delivered, a knock came on the front door, and it was the president of, guess what? The Homeowners Association. In his hand, he had documents. He handed them to the new buyers and said, welcome to the neighborhood. Obviously, you don't have these. Let me be the first to give them to you because you can't have that shed. Now, as you can see, that would be a big problem.
So what happened?
So fortunately in this situation for me is I had a document from the seller stating there was no HOA. In fact, she completely forgot. And in this particular case, they were able to work through it. There's other situations too where, buyers, they buy the house, they want to change the exterior paint colors. They're within an HOA and they're not allowed to do it. Maybe they want to put a fence up and that may not be allowed. So you really need to look at the documents of the HOA. Here in Maryland, once the buyer receives those documents, whether they're HOA or condominium documents, they have a certain period of time to review them where they can actually cancel the contract, walk away, because they find out things like, a big one is, let's say you're buying a condominium unit, like a flat or an apartment style home, and they want to rent it later when they move to somewhere else. Well, the condominium documents may specifically say no rentals. So these are the types of things that may impact your decision on whether you want to buy or not.
Something to think about. You may or may not like to be told what you can and can't do with your home. For example, in a historical district, you would need to get approval for any modification through the Historical Society.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, that's the worst. I mean, if you're buying a house that's on the registry, it is a historical home. Just like Melissa said, I mean, you have to go for approvals for everything. And a lot of times, maybe they only meet once a month. And there's a lot of back and forth, and you have to build it a certain way or do any renovations a certain way. Can be very, very costly.
Something as a buyer that you can run across is something known as a latent defect. And what that is the seller has knowledge of a potential defect in the home that you may not be able to visually see as a buyer on your own.
So latent defects, just like Melissa said, are things that the seller has knowledge of that are covered up. So for instance, if there was a crack in the foundation wall and the seller knew it and purposefully covered it up with drywall so that you couldn't see it, if you found out about that later, it could mean trouble for the seller. But also, when we're talking about knowledge of the seller, things that are wrong, this is one of the primary reasons why you want to get a home inspection. But I do want to tell you a couple caveats to that. Number one, most home inspectors will not move anything. They won't move furniture out of the way. So if there is an outlet, for example, that is behind a couch that doesn't work, if the couch is covering the outlet, the inspector is not going to check that outlet. So what you need to do as a buyer is you have to make certain that you're paying attention to things that you want to make sure are inspected, and make sure that you're telling the seller's agent that these things have to be moved so that the inspector has access. Now, depending on your state, sellers may or may not have to disclose what they know or don't know about the property. And this, guys, because of buyer remorse, is what we're seeing nationwide as a major complaint against the sellers and the agents.
And that segues into a perfect latent defect, which is where water penetration, where it can leak in the basement when it rains.
And most sellers know about this, right? If they lived in the house for any period of time, they know that in heavy rains or in every rain, that water enters the basement. If that's something that they're not disclosing and you move in and find that later, this is a big problem. So we want to make sure that when you're getting a home inspection, that your inspector actually uses a moisture meter on at least the exterior walls, high and low, to determine if there's any moisture behind any type of finished wall or block. Now, I was just having a conversation with my attorney earlier today, and he said that it is amazing how many inspectors are not carrying moisture gauges at this point.
Recently, I was showing a house and there appeared to be moisture in the basement. And as we put our hand on the wall, it was cool to touch, and you could tell that there had definitely been moisture behind the wall.
Another thing, so we're talking about, a lot of states, you don't have basements. So a lot of the water issues that we're seeing are basements, and I saw a comment the other day where somebody said, what's a basement? A basement is actually a lower level that is partially or completely in the ground. So there could be steps accessing that lower level from inside. It could be finished space. It could be a movie theater room, a gym. It could be many different things, but it's actually a below grade space in the home. And this is where we see a lot of the water penetration issues. Obviously, it's below grade. There are drains a lot of times that get covered, and when it rains, water will come in through exterior doors, below grade doors. But the big thing here, guys, is that you have to know that if you have a basement or an area that's below grade, you have to know, is there a sump pump? And what a lot of people don't realize, a lot of buyers, is that if the power goes out for whatever reason, the sump pump and the pit that's in the ground ejects water as it's coming in the house. If the electric goes out, that sump pump is not working, pumping water out. And once it gets up to the level of the pit or the can, if you will, it then starts to spill out. And if there's finished space in the basement, carpeting, things like that, it can make a mess. So what I always tell my buyers is, if you're buying a house with a basement, if there's a sump pump, if the power goes out, connect a small generator, get that pump going, or you just may need to cup the water out, keep the water below the level of the pit so that you don't have water overflowing into your brand new carpet.
Another thing is you can also have a battery backup for your sump pump. I mean, who knows how long the power is going to be out for, but at least it's an option and will carry you through for the short term.
Another thing I want to mention here, is that when you're walking through the house, maybe you want to take specific notes or have your agent download for you the photos that are in the listing. Sometimes we see that, where the sellers, after the house is sold, they take that really expensive chandelier or, something that was attached to the wall and swap it out for something else. So you want to take note of the things that you really like about the house that's attached, to make sure that when you're going through that final walkthrough just before settlement, to make sure everything is exactly as it was. And if the seller is planning on taking something here locally in Maryland, we have what's called an inclusion exclusion, and that lets you know that that nice Adirondack furniture on the patio stays or goes with the seller.
Speaking of Adirondack chairs, that brings us right to talking about if you are purchasing a heavy wooded lot, there's a lot to think about on the trees on the property.
That's true, because in the wintertime, if you're buying a house when there's no leaves on the trees, you may not realize that one of those big trees surrounding your house could be dead. And what that means is it could be a $4,000 or $5,000 bill, sometimes more, to remove the tree. And finally, guys, we just want to mention again that when you're buying a home, a lot of this due diligence was really going to fall on your shoulders, because you're getting what you buy, whether the seller tells you or not. And a lot of times the agents don't know. And, so you can't really blame them if you move in and you find these things out. But there are a lot of things that you can do as a buyer to do some additional due diligence. If you go to your State Department of Assessments and Taxation, a lot of times you can find the tax bill of the property that you're interested in, and it will tell you important things like who owns the house, how long they've owned it, and what they paid for the home. Another important thing is that a lot of counties put their permits online, so you can verify and check, what permits have been pulled through the years for that property. Something else that's really important is that if you know the house has been sold over the last several years, you may be able to see the prior listing photos of the inside and outside of the home so that you can compare what upgrades, if any, have been done. Okay, that wraps us up, guys. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, you can give it a thumbs up. It'll let Melissa and I know that you did.
We appreciate your questions and comments. Keep them coming.
And if you haven't already done so, you can subscribe to our channel and hit that alert bell to let you know every time we upload videos just like this one. See you next time.
See you next time.
Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.